Here to talk about the evolution of information security threats, please welcome from Rackspace, Paul Carer and LVH.
All right. So hello. I'm Paul Carer. I'm a principal engineer with Rackspace Managed Security, and I specialize in cryptographic engineering.
And I'm LVH. I'm also a principal engineer, and I work with Paul at Rackspace Managed Security. I specialize in cryptography and distributed systems engineering.
So we're here to talk to you about the evolution of information security threats. So first of all, it's useful to talk about what actually is going on right now. So attacks over the last 20 years have evolved dramatically. In the past, you were looking at attacks that would just be automated spray and praise that went across the entire IPv4 address space. They were frequently just weaponized versions of exploits from years ago, and they were just basically script kiddies attempting to find vulnerabilities, and they didn't really care where those vulnerabilities were. These days, you're seeing far more advanced attacks. Those attacks are frequently using multiple vulnerabilities, many of which may have been purchased on exploit markets, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And those vulnerabilities are basically chained together to gain ingress into systems, using them to either bypass your existing protections or potentially create entirely new avenues of entry where none existed before. And finally, these attacks are far more visible. 20 years ago, the amount of data you were dealing with was much lower. Your breach possibilities were commensurately, therefore, not nearly as significant. When something went wrong, you were able to contact those individual customers directly, and in general, it would not gain a lot of press. These days, a major breach will result in a front-page article on the New York Times and any number of other newspapers that you might want to not be present in. So the hallmark of the most common or the most severe threat that we see these days is the advanced persistent threat. This is an acronym that was originally coined around the time the RSA breach several years ago. It's really just a catch-all to talk about a class of attack. And that class of attack is a human-driven attack. So whereas I was talking earlier about an automated attack that's run against a wide swath of things, in this case, you have a human or team of humans that are very specifically looking for something. That makes these a reactive attack, in that as they probe your defenses, they will alter their offensive attack to meet and work around the things you're attempting to defend against. It's ongoing. Instead of seeing an attack that it came, and then once that attack occurs and you've defended against it, you don't need to worry about that anymore. Now you're looking at a far more 24/7 kind of approach. If you try and relax your guard for even a moment, then they're going to try and gain entry and then hopefully do it without you noticing. And finally, these are very, very targeted attacks. Again, previously you were looking at something where they would just be automated. The attacker didn't really care who they were getting into. In this case, you're now seeing not only targeting an organization, not even necessarily targeting that organization's division. They may be targeting specific data within that organization's division. And to do this, they're gaining all sorts of internal knowledge. They may be doing spear phishing attacks against your CEO. They may be doing things like calling your support lines and attempting to get you to reset various employees' passwords such that they can gain entry into the systems. Any number of other things of that nature that they are absolutely targeting very specifically.
So it's one thing to say that attacks are more prevalent, but it can be extremely valuable to try and examine why that is the case. Like, what are the circumstances that have led to this? And so there are a number, but one of them is certainly that there is simply more information up for grabs. So first of all, there are significantly more services being used, and those services contain significantly more data. So if somebody told you 10 years ago that their HR systems and their benefit systems were being run by a third-party company on that company's computers, that would have sounded crazy, and for most, especially smaller companies right now, that is the norm, not the exception. Of course, that's not just HR that we're using there. I single out HR there because they have a lot of extremely vulnerable, they have a lot of information that needs to be protected. Another thing is the huge success of cloud computing. So this is a somewhat unfortunate side effect. If you make it incredibly easy to put information on the cloud, if you make it incredibly easy to get computers on the cloud that will do all sorts of computation for you, if you make it incredibly easy to get push-button services that will do things for you, then obviously people are going to put more information there. And once there's more information there, then it becomes a more valuable target. Also, a lot of the people using those services aren't necessarily fully aware of the security consequences of that, because the security consequences of the way that they used to do things were significantly different from the security consequences of the way that we do things today. Also, a lot of that information is extremely valuable. So there's PII, or personally identifiable information. That's things like your name, date of birth, your address, maybe phone numbers. There's a lot of customer data on there. So a lot of customer data obviously is PII. That also includes things like purchasing history. Purchasing history can be valuable to an attacker. You might not even know that maybe you're a part of a different attack and they're really attacking your customer, and they would like to know what that customer has purchased from you, because that gives them an in, that gives them some information that they can leverage to break into your customer's environment. And finally, there's intellectual property. So IP is an extremely valuable target. Imagine if you're an attacker attacking the pharmaceutical vertical, a pre-patent drug is an extremely valuable piece of information. Similarly, if you were to, say, attack a car manufacturer, the designs for the next generations of cars, that is extremely valuable information. And it's not trivial to sell that, but it's certainly valuable. And the other problem is, as Paul has already mentioned, that the attacks have evolved. So why have the attacks evolved? Well, first of all, the funding has changed. So it used to be the case that the way that an attack worked would be someone would have maybe access to a lot of computers, but that wasn't necessarily because they had a lot of money to spend. That would be a particular computer virus that was very successful. And now suddenly an attacker has a botnet at their disposal with hundreds of thousands of computers. These days, we're talking about state-level funding. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it is actually a nation-state funding it. Sometimes it is. But it does mean that we're talking ballpark figures what a very, very large enterprise or a nation-state would be able to throw at this. As a consequence of that, because the funding has increased, obviously the exploit market for that is, the exploit market has increased tremendously. So the export market is quite robust now. It has boomed incredibly in the last few years. And so not only has it boomed just in terms of numbers, in terms of revenue and amount of exploits available, you've even started to see market specialization within that market, within the exploit market. So that's what that means is so that an exploit vendor or an exploit seller will be targeting specific market verticals. Typically, that would mean, say, a particular kind of market vertical is likely to use several pieces of software in unison, so they will sell you exploit kits that attack a combination of those pieces of software. So this is, I'm not going to say turnkey, but it's pretty close to turnkey. So this obviously has also changed as a consequence of the fact that the people buying these exploits have changed, because the people buying these exploits are looking for a specific vertical or even a specific company, so obviously the supply grows to match the demand. And really at the bottom of this is a fairly simple market equation. Like as long as the amount of revenue that an exploit writer can gain from selling these things is much greater than the cost of developing them, and you combine that with the relatively low risk of being even found out, let alone punished or prosecuted in any way, people are going to do this because it just makes economic sense. Now there's a term called the security poverty line that sort of describes the base level that you want to be at as an enterprise for, like, what is the living wage equivalent of security practices. And it is absolutely true, most organizations don't have security in their budget. They simply can't afford the things that they would need to do, right now at least. And that's true, but the problem doesn't really end there. It is a significantly more complicated and deep-rooted problem, and the factors contributing to that go far beyond simply a lack of money. One other problem is a lack of specialized talent. So information security professionals are right now few and far between. That is changing somewhat. There are significantly more flowing into the job market than there were many years ago. But obviously you also want seniority, you want experience, you want people who really, really know what they're doing. And you can't rush that. That simply takes time. And right now we're not there yet. And if you compare the number of organizations that really need a security team, well then you're talking about 3 to up to maybe a dozen or so people per company, And right now, even one company doing that honestly already puts a fairly sizable dent in the community of these information security professionals. There simply aren't that many of them. So that's a real problem. But even if let's say that you had the money wasn't an issue, let's say that you had the talent, then you're still not really done. So Paul and I and a number of our colleagues, both at Rackspace and in the greater industry, we've attended a conference, let's say RSA conference, which is probably one of the biggest security vendor conferences in the world. And when you're walking around on the expo floor there's a ton of vendors. And they all have products to sell, and many of them are really good. But just examining what those individual products even do is a surprisingly difficult task, because a lot of these products are already fairly specialized. The companies that are going to those conferences, trying to get that high level of security, are already a small fraction of all total enterprises. So that means that the tools are advanced, the tools are expensive, and so figuring out what these individual tools do is already fairly complex. But then the problem is you don't want one single tool. You don't want to fix one single problem. It may very well be that you have a tool that fixes one problem extremely well, but that's not the problem you have. You want to be able to cover all of your bases. So it's difficult to figure out what one tool does, but you don't want one tool. You want a portfolio of tools that gives you, in the aggregate, on the whole, a good security story. And then finally, another asymmetry between defense and offense is just the increasing cost of defense. So this is something Paul has alluded to already. Because these attacks are going to be, they're going to be adaptive, they are ongoing, and as a consequence of that, you can no longer simply get away with what you used to do. Your monitoring has to be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It used to be the case that the good security story was to have a competent system administrator. And that person would make sure that your software is patched all of the time and that your firewalls were configured correctly. And that already put you all the way at the top of the stack of most companies. And that's no longer true. As the expertise of the attacking side, the offensive side, moves into highly specialized domain experts that are using significantly more sophisticated attacks, similarly, defense has to move on. Defense has to no longer sit idly by with stuff that worked 20 years ago. They need to evolve to address these threats. And then finally, because you need that effective monitoring, that means that your cost is incredible, like it blows up incredibly, because you're talking about N analyst salaries, where N is somewhere between 3 and 12, usually. Those people need equipment. And then the licenses for that software, as I already mentioned, we're talking about niche software, niche market, and as a result, the licenses for this stuff tend to run pretty high costs fairly quickly.
So to sum it up, SMEs, small, medium enterprises, frequently do not have the resources. And that's not just a cash, but frequently a manpower or an ability to find the people they're looking for problem. Companies have better things to do. And by that, I don't mean security is unimportant. What I mean is that each company has a core competency and the value they're attempting to deliver to customers. And security is a requirement to be able to deliver that effectively, but it is not the thing they want to do. And finally, the tools that you need to use to defend against these sorts of things become less accessible over time. As the attacks get more advanced, the tools to defend against them become necessarily more specialized, and it requires more and more expertise to understand which tools you need and how they all fit together in the jigsaw that is your security perimeter. So, we've talked a whole lot about what it looks like, what it looks like to be attacked and how these attacks sort of occur. So the question is, how is it that we're going to help with this? So on the side of protecting or improving the state-of-the-art in security software and writing secure software in general, Rackspace sponsors several open source projects. Among them are several Python projects that we'd like to call out today. So the Python Cryptographic Authority, or PyCA, is a umbrella organization that we operate on GitHub that houses numerous cryptographic libraries for Python. LVH and I are founding members of it, and we've been working on it for about 3 years now. In that time, the flagship library that we support is called Cryptography. It supports the standard things you'd expect. We have signing, verification, encryption, and decryption. And then on top of that, on top of those primitives, we supply a concept called recipes. Recipes are cryptographic constructs that, when used within the bounds that they're designed, which are clearly documented, developers who are not familiar with cryptographic concepts can safely employ cryptography within their applications. These sorts of things have been relatively successful. In fact, I would go so far as to say quite successful in the broader market, in that tools such as OpenStack have adopted it for Keystone for Net tokens, which are a bearer token that allows you to have stateless behavior for logins, and therefore allows much higher scalability for Keystone logins, and numerous other places. On top of that, we worked on pip. Pip is the Python package manager, and historically the provenance of the packages you downloaded was, let's say, questionable a little bit. Specifically, the Python package managers originally downloaded everything over plain text HTTP. This meant that anyone who was downloading packages had no assurance that that package had not been tampered with in transit. So we undertook a project that allowed us to make sure that when you're downloading something from PyPI, the Python package index, that you know that you talked to the right server and got the package you were expecting. Finally, we've spent some time about a year and a half ago working on the Python standard library TLS implementation. So when you need to communicate with servers, you need to open a socket and talk. And the Python standard library supports a variety of protocols, including transport layer security. However, historically, while it allowed you to connect to a server and perform the handshake and do the things you'd expect, it didn't do the one thing you probably expect the most, which is validate the server certificate. Now, this was a thing you could add yourself, and developers who were savvy and senior enough to know what to do would do so. But the vast majority of projects out there were actually lacking any sort of protection against man-in-the-middle attacks because this sort of thing wasn't there by default. So we spent some time improving that and landing that back in the main Python tree so that when you install Python these days, you are guaranteed a secure by default configuration. Of course, that helps a lot with developers, and that certainly helps if you're using Python, and it helps you even if you're not using Python, because many of the things you rely upon day to day in both personal and business life do use Python. But it doesn't help you if your box has been rooted already. It doesn't help you if you've developed an authentication scheme that turns out to be bypassable in some fashion or have some other sort of hole. And it doesn't help you if your TLS configuration is broken. TLS, as we know, is one of the most critical underpinnings of the internet at this point. You cannot communicate securely for data in transit without using TLS, or at least you cannot easily communicate securely. However, TLS has multiple protocol versions. TLS has multiple cipher suites that correspond to different protocol versions, and as has been in the press quite a bit in the last few years, TLS has had issues. And to mitigate those issues, you need to know what's going on with the various protocol versions, and you need to understand what the current state-of-the-art is in cryptographic analysis for this. In addition to that, you also need to understand what it is your customers need to be able to communicate with your services. So ultimately, there is a risk-reward trade-off that comes with saying, well, I want to be the most secure versus I actually need to be able to service my customers. So that kind of combination is the thing that is not solved by writing cryptographic libraries.
Historically, Rackspace has provided a bunch of security services. And typically, that would be in the form of, let's say, devices. So if you had a number of dedicated machines at Rackspace, then we would help you select, we would help you configure and maintain those devices. So that would be a firewall, a web application firewall, an intrusion detection system, et cetera, et cetera. And those things are great. Those things are necessary. Because the attacks that we mentioned that were going on in the past still exist, but they've sort of been degraded from the status of attack to being just the background radiation of the internet. And a number of our customers, when they asked for help around this, they would typically, they would come with a specific ask for a specific kind of device, and then we'd help them set up that device. But very often, what they wanted and what they asked for was a comprehensive vision, an opinionated strategy for how you actually secure an environment. Because they understood this problem very well. They understood that they didn't have that expertise in-house. And most of the time, for other problems, they'd reach out to Rackspace to solve that for them. And they would like Rackspace to do that for security. And up until recently, Rackspace didn't really have an answer for that. And so that's why we built Rackspace Managed Security. And so Rackspace Managed Security's mission is fairly clear. It is customer-facing security services. So customer facing as opposed to internal. We already had our own internal security team. They monitor our internal networks. They monitor our machines that rackers use every day. But they didn't really do direct protection of customer environments. And so we also wanted to do that as a service because of all the problems that we've already mentioned. There's expertise problems, there's cost problems, so we really wanted to be able to deliver that with as little input, or rather with as much of a turnkey solution as possible. And right now, our security offering, or Rackspace's managed security offering, rather, consists of two parts. And so the first part is managed security, which is really the security as a service, if you will. And what that means is you get access to our CSOC, which stands for Customer Security Operations Center. That would be the 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, continuous monitoring and analysis. So that has a number of teams of analysts, has 3 teams of analysts that go from more tactical, so people who are really in the day-to-day looking at particular network connections, all the way up to more strategic, so people who are trying to put together the puzzle of the greater attack that's going on over a longer period of time. And of course, those people need data to analyze. So we also have an analytics platform. And that analytics platform consists of an actual data analysis part. So that would be stuff like aggregations, outlier detection, all the things that you want to do in order to detect ongoing attacks. And then, of course, the raw data. So typically, now that consists of a number of agents being installed on individual machines within your environment. And those agents report the raw data. Some of that is already about security. Some of that is a little bit more noisy, and that's what the CSOC is for. And so that's where we really, really leverage the fact that we're a hosting provider and that we can operate at a bigger scale than individual customers, or our customers. So for example, we can correlate across customers. So if we see a particular style of attack becoming in vogue, or a particular avenue of attack happening for a particular customer, we can use that knowledge to help defend future attacks with future customers. We can use that knowledge to possibly even preventatively go and improve other customers' environments. And then also there's a lot of internal network data, for example. So obviously if you're using a cloud provider, then there's a lot of infrastructure behind that makes that possible. And that infrastructure is ideally not available to you as a user of the public cloud. However, because we're the hosting provider, we know about that infrastructure, and we can leverage all of that information that we get from there in order to do security analysis. Another benefit, for example, is if we get threat intelligence from third-party services, obviously once we learn that, then that applies to all of our customers, whereas if a customer were to try to do that individually, then they would have to purchase that individually as well. So there's a number of economies of scale at work there. And then secondly, there's compliance assistance. So that would typically be, most common one would be PCI DSS, where we provide the expertise. So that's essentially, most of these standards, they use extremely domain-specific knowledge. It takes a lot of training to be able to really understand what that means. And so we provide that expertise. We provide support, make sure that your environments stay compliant, and that also when the audit comes, that the auditor is convinced that they are compliant. And then finally, we provide all of the tooling around that to make sure that that's effective and efficient. Now, one important thing, and it's not always the way that PCI compliance in particular has been done in the past, we are actively choosing not to do teach the test compliance. So if you are not interested in truly measurably improving your environment, and you're just interested in getting the PCI sticker, then we probably can't really help you. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to get compliance as a consequence of security. So that means that we secure your environment, and it's because your environment is secure, you will pass the tests with flying colors. That's largely that's actually possible because specs have become saner over the years. Particularly PCI, again, was a pretty bad culprit there. Older versions of PCI, typically, they asked you to do a number of things that may or may not really materially impact the security of your environment. In some cases, it might actually have made it worse. And yet, so PCI required you to do that. These days, PCI, especially the most current version, 3.1, has really, really improved on that front. And I look forward to seeing them improve in the future That said, I'm convinced that with the managed security offering in particular, the things that we're doing right now are truly at the cutting edge of where technology is, the stuff that is actually productized and that is ready to be able to be used in the enterprise. And therefore, I foresee that people who are using managed security will have that benefit of essentially passing those compliance requirements fairly easily for many years to come. And that's all we have. And with that, we have quite a bit of time for questions. Thank you for your time and attention. There's a question. There's a microphone back there.
Okay. Yep, there we go.
Thanks. Thanks for the discussion. It was great. So I have a question first for LVH. Have you ever been a security threat? I noticed that you go by your. I'm kidding. Okay, let me move on. So in the past, we were contemplating vendors for our solution. It's still under development, and we were told at the time that Rackspace wasn't kind of in the running. I've kind of been under the impression now that that is changing. So are there changes that you've made, and you've shared a lot of it, that can address some of the requirements that are by the government for FedRAMP and some of the other more sophisticated security issues?
So,
Thanks.
okay, so if I understand the question correctly, it's what are the things that we are doing that would help against a like nation-state sized threat actor, or
Or a broader, like a broader audit portfolio. Yeah. Yeah, it's a specific audit requirement, yeah. So in that regard, like, there obviously Rackspace has many pieces, and Rackspace Managed Security right now has not chosen to expand ourselves to the point where we can do things like FedRAMP. That's certainly something we would be happy to talk about, because obviously, like, the way we drive future development on our end is knowing what our customers actually want us to do. So, like, within the dedicated environments, FedRAMP is potentially a more easily achieved thing. Within something like public cloud, maybe a little more difficult, and then private cloud is something that can be discussed. So I guess without evading, the statement would be, we're happy to talk about it. At the moment, it's not on roadmaps I'm personally aware of. Anything else?
there's a question back there. Oh, up here too. One back there, last row.
Hard to see. Yep, one in the very back. It's hard to see these lights.
Yeah.
Hi, excellent presentation. What are you seeing as far as licensing goes? User base, number of users, what's in generality? I mean, you don't have to get specific, but licensing for these kinds of things.
So for Rackspace's offerings right now? So if it's for Rackspace's offerings right now, the way we do our pricing is based on a percentage of MRR spent with us. So we don't necessarily care about how many users you have. Implicitly, we sort of care about how many servers you have, but that's kind of built into that assumption. So that's the way we do our pricing. Incidentally, when we offer the managed security offering, we currently don't have a way to say, oh, well, I only want it over this part of my environment, like only 30% of the environment I want covered. We prefer to cover all or nothing. And the reason for that is that we've found in the past that many of the times when people say, well, this is the only part of my environment that matters, what they really mean is, well, that's where the data is, but in reality, there's this many ingress points all around in the part of the environment that they don't think needs protecting. So to be able to actually provide an effective security perimeter, we need to be able to get on all the devices that you want to actually, that you host with us.
And if there is a real material reason why a particular device should be excluded, let's say that it runs some software that's incompatible with some agents, for example, then we'll do that, but those things are exceptions, and also the pricing model reflects that, right? So we actively want to dissuade that for the reasons that Paul just mentioned. If you look at real-world postmortems of real attacks, then very often you'll see like, oh, well, the production environment was secured pretty well, but there were a couple of production keys in the staging environment, and they broke into the staging environment with the back door that was pretty much just open.
Or we're highly effectively firewalled, but it turns out our HVAC can talk to our payment gateway.
And also, I was wondering, you know, from you starting on-prem, and you had some tools there that you think maybe they're applicable up here. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. You know better than I do. But generally, as far as moving a license, Have you had experiences with that? Is it difficult? Does it cost you more money as far as, vendors being site-specific or those kinds of things?
So that's something that's essentially a problem that Rackspace Managed Security owns for you. So it's if at any given time, like it's not like we're trying to hide what we're doing to your environment, obviously. If at any given time you want to know what we're doing, then we'll happily tell you. If you want to know when we change it, we'll happily tell you. However, part of the deal is that because these products are continuously evolving, because the attacks are continuously evolving, saying that we're going to give you this and in perpetuity doesn't really help your environment be secure. So we can and have and will again change the portfolio and the things that we actually use to secure your environment. And that means that we have to deal with the licensing problems behind the scenes on that. So that is something that you will not see unless you opt into it. I'm sorry, I can't really hear you. Can you speak into the microphone?
It sounds like a very fluid, good solution that you're offering. Pre this, it's like you're locked into some kind of license based on something. So
Right, yeah.
you got a lot of fluidity and flexibility, it sounds. So,
Yeah, that's definitely a big part of it. Also, just because of the scale that we have, that enables us to just essentially negotiate better terms so that that sort of problem doesn't really happen. That's certainly something that customers have seen in the past. Very often, you'd also see customers that in other environments, like they would already have bought this piece of software, and they would say like, well, we'd like you to apply this to our environment, and it's not really it's not the jigsaw piece that they wanted. And so that's really tricky, and that's why we very, very consciously attempted to remove all of that from the customer. And like I said, if they're interested, we'll happily tell you. We're absolutely not trying to hide it, but we do reserve the right to change that based on whatever we feel is appropriate at any given time.
Coming up on your right. So, yeah, in real life, if let's say we are private cloud customers and we want to enlist the managed services, how does the onboarding go for this? You guys can conduct a security audit, and how detailed is it? Do you do a code review of the web application? Like, what is the scope beyond which you don't go?
I've been talking a lot, so.
Sure. All right. The initial statement there would be that the way we initially onboard people into the Rackspace Managed Security offering is to say we have a set of agents that we'd like to install in every endpoint. In the case of a private cloud offering, that might be on your virtual machines, it might be on your hypervisors as well. And then that data flows back obviously into our CSOC for that type of analysis to occur, the correlation and other things of that nature. For things on top of that, where you're talking about like you're concerned about doing pen testing or code review of that nature, we don't personally do that. Now, we've talked in the past about it, and it turns out what we found is that we know people, and when I say people, I should say corporations. We know corporations and people inside those corporations who are extraordinarily good at pen testing. Companies like Matsusano, although they have now recently been acquired, and others they build teams, and those teams are incredibly good at this sort of thing. So we're happy to put you in touch with those sorts of teams and kind of act as a broker to talk about what you need to have accomplished. But for our own part, we won't claim to say that we're going to do pen testing and things of that nature.
Thank you.
I mean, whenever we looked at that, it became obvious fairly quickly that given how hard it is to build up these teams and the fact that these teams exist because of years of experience and working as a team together, if we were to try and, that makes it a very high barrier to entry. If we were to try and build a team like that ourselves, we would not be able to deliver a competitive, qualitative service in any reasonable time frame. So that's why we prefer to work with third parties.
Hi, I had perhaps a follow-up question to that is, say there's been a security breach of some form. Is part of your service involved with having a response in place or a plan in place of how to respond for an application?
Do you mean publicly or in response, just simply improving the environment?
Like internal incident response kind of thing?
Actually, I'm interested in both. I mean, my personal interest happens to be at the time much more in public-facing websites and web applications that are, used by the public, or they're hosted in your public cloud. But wonder if you have services related to that, or you're responsive to both internal and external.
So internally, absolutely, certainly. I mean, if they got in, that means that something went wrong, and that's something that certainly we would address as part of that. Externally, I would say that as more as guidance, as strong guidance, not so much in that. Right now, that's not so much a turnkey. We will take care of everything for you, white glove style service. I'm sure that's something that Jarrett Rame, who's the person I think it's fair to say that Rackspace Managed Security is Jarrett Rame's brainchild. I think he'd be more than happy to talk to you about that. Right now, that's not a thing that we explicitly do as part of the service.
Okay, thank you.
There's been a question.
Just a quick question on security as a consequence. To what degree is that dealing with risk officer concerns about moving to cloud, either public or private? Is it something that's attractive to them, or is it just that objection is still going to be out there in their minds?
So the nature of cloud, like objections to moving to cloud, are well-founded in that, like, the model of risk that risk officers tend to use involves like multi-tenancy and things of that nature, right? So when you're leveraging like burst capacity and being able to rapidly increase and decrease things, by its very nature, you're accepting some level of trade-off. So in that regard, that risk is not going away because you're talking about compliance. Now, obviously, over the course of the last 5 to 6 years, as the cloud has gotten larger, tooling to help mitigate those risks has gotten better and better. Although commensurately, attacks have also improved in some ways. But certainly, in general, the story has gotten better and will continue to get better. That said, people who have risk profiles that find it unacceptable to operate on potentially shared infrastructure start looking at things like our dedicated offerings or private clouds, where they can have dedicated infrastructure that acts as if it's a public cloud. And in those regards, that tends to be the route that companies with risk profiles like that will take.
We have time for one more quick question, but Paul and I will be available throughout the rest of the day outside. We just have to clear the stage for the next presenter.
Sure. Thank you for the presentation. And I'm primarily asking, like, what level of security do you guys provide? Or you go all the way to encrypt your data? Because most of our clients are banking and hedge fund.
So when you say levels, so if we try and speak in objective terms, then I guess we're mostly looking at compliance levels, or
Yes.
So I would say that if right now that is not where our customers are coming from. That has mostly historic, and that kind of goes into the previous gentleman's question. Like, where is the limit between what is a reasonable security posture and what is mostly fear, uncertainty, and doubt of the cloud, let's say. And I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Like, it's certainly true that if you're operating on a public cloud, there are a number of security concerns that you have to be worried about, where if you're talking about your own machines running in your own data center, that those problems go away. So that's a very complex question, which I think I'm going to go ahead and take that one outside, because that would the amount of time that would take me to answer that one is significantly longer than I could reasonably still
okay.
manage the stage for. So, but thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you very
everyone,
much.
for your time and attention.